The knife was already at Dahlia Arden's throat before she understood what she had walked into. The grand hall of Corvinus Court stretched 40 feet above her head, all black marble and iron chandeliers dripping with cold white candles, and every vampire in the room was staring at her with the flat, predatory stillness of creatures who had simply decided she was already dead. There were perhaps 30 of them, arranged in a loose, devastating semicircle, and not one of them was looking at the vampire, Heir, who stood 6 feet behind Dahlia, with his hands clasped at his back like he was attending a particularly dull diplomatic function rather than watching a member of his own court press a blade to a human girl's jugular. They were not looking at him because to them, he was not entirely there. That was the secret that Dahlia Arden had spent 4 months learning, and it was the secret that had brought her here tonight in a borrowed black dress, with a folder of evidence tucked against her ribs, and the specific, dangerous knowledge that Leander Corvinus, heir to the oldest vampire bloodline in Europe, was being systematically erased from his own court by the very people who called him master. The vampire holding the knife was named Serafan Voss. He had silver blonde hair and eyes the color of old amber, and he smiled like a man who had already won. "The human heiress," Serafan said pleasantly. "You were warned, Miss Arden, 3 times if I recall. And here you are anyway." "Here I am," Dahlia agreed. Her voice came out steadier than she had any right to expect. Her heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her temples, but she kept her chin level and her eyes forward because she had learned in the last 4 months that showing fear to a vampire court was the single fastest way to die in one. "Let her go." The words came from behind her, quiet and absolute, like the sound a glacier makes when it finally decides to move. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 3 degrees. Serafan's smile flickered. And here was the thing about Leander Corvinus that his court had spent 2 centuries trying to forget. When he chose to be present, when he pulled the full weight of his attention into a room, the air itself seemed to decide it owed him deference. Not because of theatre or performance, not because of the white hair that fell past his shoulders like spilled moonlight, or the pale, devastating architecture of his face, or even the ancient power that moved in him like deep water, but because Leander Corvinus was, in the marrow of every real thing he had ever done, entirely, lethally serious. And tonight, Dahlia Arden was the thing he was serious about. Serafan did not move the knife. "My lord," he said carefully, "the blood law is clear. A human who enters the inner court without a formal blood bond or an elder's seal is standing under my protection," Leander said, "which is older than your blood law, older than this court, and considerably older than you. Let her go." The knife dropped, Dahlia breathed. She had first encountered Leander Corvinus 4 months ago in the most undramatic way imaginable. She had been sitting in the reading room of her father's estate, which was one of those grand old London townhouses that had been in the Arden family since the Regency era, and which her father, Marcus Arden, had spent 30 years quietly converting into the financial backbone of one of the most powerful human vampire liaison firms in Western Europe. Dahlia had grown up knowing about vampires, the way other children grew up knowing about taxes, as a significant and unglamorous feature of adult life that would eventually become her responsibility. Marcus Arden had died 8 months before that evening. Suddenly, without warning, in the back of a car on the way to a meeting that his calendar described only as CA Court Consult. Dahlia had inherited everything: the firm, the accounts, the alliances, and the slow creeping suspicion that her father had not simply died of a cardiac event at 57. She had been going through the encrypted files on his private server when she found the first reference to the Corvinus heir, not in the context of a client or an ally, in the context of a warning. Her father had written in the clipped shorthand he used for things he considered too dangerous to spell out directly, "LC invisible to own court." They use his name but not his will. If something happens to me, find him first. She had found him, eventually, not because vampires were easy to locate, but because Dahlia was exceptionally good at finding things people wanted hidden. She had followed a chain of property records, shadow companies, and art auction purchases across 6 cities, until the trail ended at a building in Edinburgh that officially housed an antiquarian bookshop and unofficially housed the second deepest vault of vampire court records in the Northern Hemisphere. Leander had been there when she walked in. He had been sitting behind a desk covered in open manuscripts, wearing a dark shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, and he had looked up at her with those eyes, pale silver grey, ancient and precise, and said, "You are Marcus Arden's daughter." "Yes," she had said, "and you are the heir who has been stripped of his own authority while everyone in your court pretends it isn't happening." He had gone very still. Not the polite, social stillness of someone choosing their next word carefully, but the deep, geological stillness of something that had not been surprised in a very long time and had just been surprised. "Sit down," he had said, finally. She had sat, and that was where it had begun. The first conversation had lasted 6 hours. Dahlia had laid out everything she knew, the financial irregularities, the contract modifications signed in Leander's name that bore the secondary seal of Seraphan Voss, the court votes that had been recorded as unanimous in records that showed clear evidence of alteration, and the meeting her father had been travelling to on the day he died, which turned out to have been called by Voss's faction under a forged Corvinus seal. Leander had listened without interrupting, which was a quality Dahlia had come to understand was rarer than it ought to be. He had read every document she pushed across the desk. His expression had not changed perceptibly, but she had learned to read him in the spaces between his silences, and what she read then was a cold, controlled fury so deep it had become architectural. "You've been building this case for 3 months," he said when she finished. 4, counting the month I spent just finding you." "Why?" It was a genuine question, not a test. She had understood the difference already and respected him for it. "My father's last instruction was to find you first," she said. "I think he knew that whatever was happening in your court was connected to his death. I think he believed that if you'd have had the full picture you could stop it. And I think," she added carefully, because she had promised herself she would be honest with him even when it was uncomfortable, that whatever happens to your court has consequences that extend very far beyond your court. "My father spent 30 years building alliances between the human world and the vampire courts. If those alliances fracture because your court falls to a faction that sees humans as a resource rather than a partner, a great deal of people will be hurt." Leander had looked at her for a long moment. "And you?" he said. "What happens to you in this calculation?" "That depends on whether we can stop them," she said, simply. He had not smiled. But something in those ancient eyes had shifted. A recognition, slow and searching, like the first real light crossing a room that had been dark for a very long time. They had met 7 more times after that, always in neutral locations, always arranged through channels that Voss's network could not easily monitor. A private room at an Edinburgh art gallery, a hotel conference space booked under a shell company, the back room of a wine merchant in Mayfair, whose proprietor, a retired Corvinus court official named Aldrich, owed Leander a debt of gratitude that predated the 20th century. Each meeting had been operational, focused, precise. They had built a legal and documentary case, powerful enough to bring before the Elder Tribunal, the international body of vampire elders that superseded individual court authority and represented the closest thing the vampire world had to an independent judiciary. Voss's faction had been careful, but not careful enough, and the evidence trail Dahlia had constructed with Leander's court knowledge and her own forensic financial expertise was, by the 6th meeting, devastating. But something else had been building in those meetings, quietly and without either of them acknowledging it directly, with the particular stubbornness of a thing that does not need acknowledgement to become real. Dahlia noticed it first in small things. The way Leander always arrived before her, which she eventually understood was not habit, but protective instinct. He checked every room before she entered it, every exit, every sight line, with the efficiency of someone who has spent centuries keeping the people in his care alive. The way he pushed the foldfile back across the desk to her when Hannah had finished reviewing it, always positioned so she could reach it without stretching. The way he had in Edinburgh, without any comment or drama, placed himself between her and a door that had opened unexpectedly. Not dramatically, not with any announcement, simply moved, the way water moves to fill a space, and been there. She noticed the way he listened to her. Not the polite listening of someone waiting to speak, but the full, attending silence of someone who was genuinely interested in the way her mind worked. When she made connections between pieces of evidence he had not seen yet, he tracked the logic with visible attention. When she was wrong about something, it happened twice. Both times in areas of vampire court law she had not fully understood. He corrected her without condescension, simply as a matter of precision. She noticed the way he looked at her, sometimes, when he thought she was focused on the documents. Like something rare that he had not expected to encounter and was not entirely sure what to do with. By the 7th meeting, Dahlia had acknowledged privately to herself that she was in considerable emotional trouble. Not because it was impossible. She had not grown up in the Arden family without understanding that human-vampire relationships existed, that the blood law permitted formal bonds between consenting parties, that the ancient codes of the vampire courts, for all their brutality in other respects, had always contained specific protections for humans who entered into such bonds willingly. She understood the mechanics. She was not afraid of the reality. She was simply very aware that Leander Corvinus was 400 years old and the heir to the most powerful vampire bloodline in Europe, and that she was 24 and the daughter of a man whose death was connected to his court's corruption, and that the entire edifice of what they were building together was premised on trust and mutual interest, and the very reasonable hope that when it was over, he would still be here and she would still be alive. She had not said any of this out loud until the night everything broke open. It had been Aldrich who brought the warning. He had appeared at the Mayfair wine shop at midnight, 3 hours before she and Leander were due to meet there, and he had been frightened in the specific, visceral way that very old vampires were frightened. Not with the loose physical terror of something young and vulnerable, but with the cold, compressed dread of something ancient enough to know exactly what it was afraid of and why. "Voss has moved," Aldrich said. He was looking at Leander, but Leander's eyes were already on Dahlia. "The tribunal filing has been intercepted. Someone in the filing office sold the routing information. We don't know who yet. Voss knows you've built the case. He's called an emergency court session for tonight. Formal charges against the heir under the abandonment clause." Dahlia stared. The abandonment clause. If an heir abandons the duties of their bloodline for longer than 6 months, Leander said, his voice perfectly level, authority transfers to the acting regent by default. Voss has been the acting regent since my father fell into the long sleep 8 months ago. He has been ensuring deliberately that I could not perform those duties while simultaneously recording, in court documents, that I had chosen not to. The full shape of it landed in Dahlia's chest like a stone dropped into deep water. "He didn't just want to sideline you," she said. "He wanted to eliminate you entirely. Legal elimination. An heir who has abandoned his line has no standing to bring charges, no standing before the tribunal, no claim to the bloodline at all." "Yes," Leander said. "And if you lose your standing tonight, the case falls apart. The evidence becomes inadmissible under blood law because it was gathered by a claimant with no standing. Voss consolidates the court, controls the alliances, and the question of what happened to your father becomes permanently unanswerable." The silence lasted exactly 4 seconds. "Then we go tonight," Dahlia said. "To the court, in person. You perform the duties of your line in front of witnesses before the session can be closed. That is extraordinarily dangerous," Leander said. "For you specifically, I'm aware, Dahlia." The way he said her name then was different from any of the other times he had said it. Less formal, more direct, as though he had simply stopped pretending there was any professional distance between them and the thing that was actually true. "If Voss's people reach you inside that court before I can establish standing, the blood law of the inner court applies. A human without a formal bond or an elder's seal in the inner sanctum can be killed," she said flatly. "I know the law, Leander. I've read it 3 times. Then you understand why I am not willing to." "You said once," she interrupted, which was something she had never done before in any of their meetings, and which made him go very still, "that the court is full of people who look at you and see a convenient name on a document. You said the problem was not that they hated you. The problem was that they had simply stopped being able to perceive you as real, as a person rather than a symbol." She met his eyes, which was always an act requiring a specific conscious decision, because those eyes were ancient in a way that made the air between them feel different. "Come with me tonight. Be real. Be the heir. Stop letting them use your name without your presence." Something shifted in his face then, something deep, slow, and irreversible. "And you?" he said quietly. "What are you in this plan?" "I'm your witness," she said. "I'm the one who goes in with the full evidence package and stands in front of that court and tells them that the human heiress of the firm their court has depended on for 30 years has seen every piece of what Voss has done, and that the tribunal has a copy of all of it, sent tonight through 3 separate routing channels, and that if anything happens to either of us, the filing completes automatically at dawn." It was not a bluff. She had spent the previous 48 hours setting up exactly that failsafe, because she had understood, before Aldrich's warning and before any of the crisis tonight, that the endgame was always going to come suddenly and that they needed to be ready for it. Leander looked at her for a very long time, and then he said, "I need to do one thing before we go." She waited. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and took out a narrow case of dark wood, and inside the case was a ring, old, very old, white gold set with a single dark stone that Dahlia recognized after a moment as a vampire bloodstone, which, in the old court law, carried the mark of a specific bloodline, and when worn by a human with the formal acknowledgement of the heir, constituted the oldest and most unambiguous form of the elder's seal that existed in vampire law. "This is not a blood bond," he said carefully, deliberately watching her face. "This does not commit you to anything you have not chosen. It is a mark of my protection, freely given, legally binding under every court that recognizes the Corvinus line, and I am offering it because—" He paused, and in that pause Dahlia heard the 400 years of isolation and invisible exile, and the particular loneliness of a man who had been surrounded by his court his entire life and unseen by all of them. "Because you have seen me, every part of me in these 4 months, and I would very much like the world to know that I see you in return." Dahlia took the ring, she put it on, she met his eyes. "Then let's go finish this," she said. The court had known something was wrong the moment Leander walked in, not wrong in the sense of threat, wrong in the sense of a reality they had been carefully avoiding suddenly becoming inescapable. He moved through the hall with the full, unhurried weight of everything he was, and the air moved with him, and the chandeliers seemed to burn a degree brighter, and Seraphan Voss, standing at the head of the assembled court in the position of acting regent, had gone the particular color that very pale vampires go when they are genuinely alarmed. He had not expected Leander to come. He had expected, Dahlia understood, to conduct a quiet procedural elimination in an empty room with witnesses who were already bought. Then he had seen Dahlia at Leander's side, and he had made the catastrophic mistake of reaching for her, which brought them to the knife, which Seraphan had now lowered, and which Dahlia had survived, which meant that the next part could begin. Leander walked forward full through the parting crowd until he stood between Dahlia and Voss, and he said nothing for a long moment. He simply looked at Seraphan Voss the way an ocean looks at a breakwater, with the patient, terrible certainty that the outcome is not in question. "Lord Voss," he said finally, "you have called this session under the abandonment clause. Would you like to explain to this court the precise nature of the duties you claim I have abandoned?" Voss recovered well. Dahlia gave him that. "My lord," he said, smooth and composed, "the court records show clearly that over the past 8 months the heir has been absent from all formal. The court records," Leander said, "have been altered, Miss Arden." Dahlia stepped forward, opened the folder she had kept pressed against her ribs through everything, and began. She had given presentations before. She had stood in front of difficult rooms, investor boards, legal panels, joint committee hearings for human vampire regulatory bodies, and she knew how to hold a room's attention and how to make evidence speak clearly. But she had never given a presentation quite like this one, in a hall full of vampires who were variously terrified, transfixed, or calculating the odds of surviving the night. With Leander Corvinus standing at her shoulder like a living declaration that the person speaking was under his protection, and anyone who moved toward her would be answering for it personally. She laid out the evidence methodically and completely. The altered court records and the forensic markers that proved alteration. The contracts signed in Leander's name with the secondary Voss seals, and the testimony of the Arden firm's authentication experts who had examined them. The financial transfers that had redirected Corvinus court resources to accounts controlled by Voss's bloodline over a period of 7 years, and last, the meeting that had killed her father, the forged seal, the false record, the fact that Marcus Arden had died 4 hours after leaving for a Corvinus court consultation that Leander had never authorized or known about. The room was absolutely silent. Voss's composure had not broken. But the 3 vampires standing at his left flank had moved, almost imperceptibly, several inches away from him, which in vampire court body language was the equivalent of a public declaration. "These documents," Voss said when she finished, "were assembled by a human with no standing before this court, no blood bond, no elders." "She wears my seal," Leander said. His voice was soft, which in Dahlia's experience meant she should be more afraid for anyone arguing with him, not less. "My bloodstone, my mark, my formal acknowledgement before this court and every court that carries our alliance. Her standing is mine. Her evidence is mine. Her father's death. The temperature in the room dropped again, genuinely, measurably, in the way that very old vampire emotion expressed itself as physical phenomenon. Her father's death is mine to answer. The door at the back of the hall opened. 3 figures entered who Dahlia recognized from Leander's briefings. Elder vampires, ancient and white-haired in the way of their kind, wearing the formal dark seals of the tribunal. They had received the automatic filing. They were here. Voss looked at them. He looked at Leander. He looked at Dahlia. And he made the last mistake of his political life, which was to move. He was very fast, as very old vampires are, but Leander was older, and he had been waiting for exactly this. He caught Voss's wrist before the strike connected, and in the stillness that followed Dahlia could see, clearly, the precise hierarchy of power in that room, and who occupied the top of it without any ambiguity whatsoever. "I have spent 8 months," Leander said, very quietly, very close to Voss's face, "allowing this court to pretend I was not here. I allowed it because I was building a case rather than a confrontation. I allowed it because I believed the law was worth preserving even in its abuse. I will not allow it for 1 more minute." He released Voss into the custody of the tribunal guards who had moved forward with the smooth efficiency of people who had done this before, and then he turned to his court. His full court. 30 vampires who had spent 8 months looking through him, around him, past him, and he stood in front of them with his full 4 centuries of authority and simply waited for them to decide what they were. The court bowed. Not in sequence, not by rank, but all at once, in the way that very old instincts override social politics when something ancient enough presents itself without ambiguity. Leander turned to Dahlia. She was shaking slightly, she noticed, which was probably reasonable given the evening's events, and she was not entirely sure her legs were going to be cooperative for much longer, and the bloodstone ring on her hand was warm in a way she had not expected. "Are you all right?" he said. "Define all right," she said. Something moved through his face, complicated, quiet, and absolutely unmistakable. He lifted one hand and touched her jaw very briefly, the lightest possible contact, checking for injury with a precision that was both clinical and desperately tender. "You should sit down," he said. "I should sit down," she agreed, and sat down on the nearest step of the dais, which was undignified, and she did not care at all. He sat beside her, which in retrospect was probably the most significant political statement he had made all evening. The Corvinus heir on the court dais steps next to a human woman in front of his entire court and 3 tribunal elders, as though that was simply where he belonged and the opinions of the assembled were a matter of profound indifference. The tribunal proceedings took 2 hours. Dahlia gave her full statement. Leander gave his. The tribunal elders, ancient, immovable, magnificent in the way of creatures so old that their skin had taken on the faint luminescence that was the mark of vampires beyond the first millennium, examined the evidence with the methodical thoroughness of an institution that had been adjudicating vampire court disputes for longer than most human nations had existed. Voss's holds were frozen. His bloodline's court privileges were suspended pending the full investigation. 3 of the court members who had been most directly involved in the record alterations surrendered their seals voluntarily, which the tribunal accepted as cooperation rather than guilt and would factor into their eventual rulings. The question of Marcus Arden's death was referred to a joint tribunal and human legal panel. a significant precedent. The eldest of the tribunal elders noted, and one that the tribunal endorsed in light of the Corvinus heir's formal acknowledgement of the Arden firm and the human heiress who now bore his seal. It was after 3 in the morning when the formal portion of the proceedings closed and the court began to disperse, slowly, with the careful quiet of people who had experienced a significant recalibration of everything they had believed to be true about their situation. Some of them looked at Leander with the expression of people rediscovering a thing they had lost. Some of them looked at Dahlia with expressions ranging from calculating assessment to something that might eventually become respect. Aldrich appeared at Dahlia's elbow with a cup of tea, which she accepted with a gratitude so sincere it was almost physical. "You did very well," Aldrich said. He was looking at her with the particular warmth of someone who had known Leander for a long time and was deeply, quietly relieved. "Both of you." "We did," Leander agreed. He was standing close enough that Dahlia could feel the specific quality of his attention, the way a room with a lit fire is different in temperature from a room without one. Not loudly different, but certainly different. Though I want it noted that my contribution consisted primarily of standing behind her, looking threatening, while she single-handedly dismantled a 7-year political conspiracy. "You caught Voss when he moved," Dahlia said. "I did one useful thing, you did 40. I counted 3, the documents, the statement, the failsafe filing. You are being modest, which I have learned is a habit of yours when you are exhausted. I am not modest, I am precise." "You are," he said, and there was something in it that was not an argument at all. They did not leave the court building for another hour. There were protocols, documentation, the formal recording of Leander's re-establishment of active authority that required specific witnesses and specific seals. Dahlia spent most of this time sitting in a smaller side room with Aldrich, who told her stories about Leander with the unguarded affection of someone who had been watching the heir be invisible to everyone around him for longer than she had been alive, and who was choosing tonight very deliberately to begin correcting that. "He was not always like this," Aldrich said. "Not always so contained. He was different before the long cycles of isolation the court put him through. Not softer, exactly, but more present." He looked at the ring on Dahlia's hand. "He has not offered that mark to anyone, ever, in 4 centuries. Dahlia looked at the ring too. The bloodstone caught the candlelight and held it, deep and dark and extraordinarily warm. "I know," she said quietly. "Does it frighten you?" She thought about it honestly, the way she always tried to think about difficult questions. "No," she said. "What frightens me is the idea of him going back to being invisible. I would very much like for him to stay visible." Aldrich smiled, old and creased, and genuinely happy. "I believe," he said, "that you have already made that impossible." When Leander came back, he stood in the doorway of the small room for a moment before entering, and Dahlia had the specific, vivid impression of him choosing to be present in a way he had been deliberately withholding, not just tonight, but for years, decades, centuries possibly, pulling himself back from the full weight of being real in order to avoid the specific pain of being unseen while fully present. She stood up. He crossed the room to her, and they were close in the way that 2 people are close, when the distance between them has become a pretense that neither of them is maintaining anymore. And the air between them was the specific quality of air before a significant thing happens. "I want to ask you something," Leander said. "All right, the ring. What I said when I gave it to you, about what it is and is not. I want to be precise about what it is." His eyes were on her face, steady and searching and stripped of the controlled distance he usually maintained. "It is my protection. It is my formal acknowledgement. It is the public record of the fact that you are significant to me in a way that supersedes court politics and blood law and the very long list of reasons why this is complicated." A pause. "It is also, if you want it to be, a beginning, not an obligation, not a claim, a beginning." Dahlia looked at him for a long moment. 4 centuries of history standing in front of her, white-haired, and ancient, and somehow improbably, asking her a question with the specific vulnerability of someone who had never asked it before and was not entirely sure what to do with the fact that he was asking it now. "It was always a beginning," she said. "I just was not going to say so until you did." The sound that came from him then was not quite a laugh. It was shorter than that and warmer, and it did something to the severe architecture of his face that Dahlia had never seen before and immediately wanted to be responsible for again. He took her face in both hands, very gently. The way someone holds something they have not allowed themselves to want for a very long time and are now allowing themselves to hold. And he kissed her with the particular restraint of someone whose self-control is the product of centuries and is being exercised now as a form of care rather than distance. Dahlia kissed him back and put her hands on his chest and felt the cold stillness of him and the deep, ancient, extraordinary warmth underneath it, and thought that this was exactly the kind of thing her father had meant when he said, "Find him first." They left the court building at 4:30 in the morning, Edinburgh grey and quiet around them, the sky beginning its slow negotiation with dawn. Leander kept his hand at the small of her back as they walked to the car, not dramatically, not possessively, simply continuously, the way someone keeps contact with a thing they want to remain near. "Sunlight," Dahlia said, because she was practical and she had been thinking about logistics. "Half an hour," he said. "The Edinburgh safe house has proper shielding. Aldrich arranged it when he knew we were coming tonight. And after sunrise, what happens to the court today? The tribunal will continue the formal proceedings. I need to be present for the morning session, which is technically possible through the shielded hall." He paused. "After that, there is a great deal of administrative correction to accomplish. 8 months of records. The alliance documents with 7 human firms, including yours, that were modified without authorization and need to be formally reversed and re-executed." Another pause, shorter. "I would very much like your involvement in that process, if you are willing." "Professionally," she said, "or personally?" "Both," he said, without hesitation. She smiled at that, and he saw it, and the look on his face was the look of someone who has not had quite enough of something and has only recently been given permission to want more. The weeks that followed were genuinely, sustainingly busy in the way that major institutional correction is busy, relentless, detailed, requiring the specific combination of legal precision and political sensitivity that Dahlia had inherited from her father and that Leander had developed over 4 centuries of watching courts rise and fall. They worked together on the alliance restoration documents, sitting across from each other in a proper office at the Corvinus court building that Leander had established in the first week of his returned authority, with proper sunlight shielding and proper documentation, and the completely unnecessary but apparently non-negotiable detail that there was always tea available, because Leander had noticed during their 4th meeting that Dahlia thought better with tea and had quietly arranged for it every single time since. The tribunal investigation into Marcus Arden's death moved forward with the Joint Human Panel and produced in its 3rd week a full accounting that established beyond legal doubt that Voss's faction had ordered Marcus Arden surveilled and had manipulated the circumstances of his final meeting in ways that, while not constituting direct murder under the strictest blood law definitions, constituted a clear violation of the inter-court protection codes governing licensed human liaisons. The findings were referred to both the tribunal and the Human Judicial Panel for concurrent sentencing. It was not everything Dahlia had wanted. She was honest with herself about this, a clean, unambiguous accounting for her father's death, the kind that would let her grieve without the complicated, exhausting asterisk of legal nuance. What she got was the closest thing the dual-world legal systems could produce, which was thorough and real, and in the end enough to let her stand at her father's grave in the Highgate Cemetery on a grey Thursday morning and say out loud to the stone and the sky and the specific absence of the man who had raised her, that she had found what he had sent her to find. Leander was there. He stood at a distance first, at the edge of the cemetery path, because this was her grief and he understood that proximity required invitation. Then she turned and looked at him. And he came. He stood beside her and did not say anything, because he was the kind of person who understood the specific weight of silence, and when it was a kindness rather than an absence, and after a while Dahlia leaned sideways and put her head against his arm, which was not something she had done before, and felt the cold solidity of him and breathed. "He would have liked you," she said eventually. "I know," Leander said. "He wrote very good things about me, for someone who was also terrified of what I represented." She laughed, wet and real. He wrote what was true. He always wrote what was true. Yes, Leander said. So do you. It is a family characteristic. A pause. One I admire. She stood up straight again and looked at her father's stone, Marcus Arden, beloved, true to the last. She had chosen that last part because it was the most important thing about him, the thread she had tried to follow in everything she had done since his death. What happens now, she said. Not urgently, not anxiously, just asking. The court stabilizes, Leander said. The alliances are restored. The tribunal investigation concludes. The long administrative work of rebuilding a court that has spent 8 months being run by a faction with no loyalty to anything real. A pause that was not like his usual pauses. And you and I negotiate the nature of whatever we are. We know what we are, Dahlia said. Yes, he said. But I would like to say it explicitly if that is acceptable. I am not accustomed to anything being this clear. He turned to look at her, and in the grey morning light he was very pale and very precise and completely, entirely present. I have been invisible to my own court for 8 months. I have been in various ways, invisible to the people around me for far longer than that, invisible by design, by necessity, by the accumulated habits of too many centuries of being used without being seen. And then you walked into a bookshop in Edinburgh and told me what I was with the calm certainty of someone who had already done the research and reached her conclusions and simply wanted to confirm them with the primary source. I had, Dahlia agreed. You saw all of it, he said, the political reality, the legal situation. The 4 centuries of, he paused and the word he chose was careful and honest, loneliness. You saw all of it without flinching and without agenda beyond the truth. And I have been, another pause. I have been trying, since that first evening, to find a way to express what that means to me that does not sound inadequate. It does not need to not sound inadequate, Dahlia said. It just needs to be true. It is true, he said. All of it. Everything I have not yet said and everything I have, it is all of it true. She reached for his hand. His fingers closed around hers with the careful, deliberate gentleness of something very powerful, choosing restraint because the thing it was holding was worth the care. Then we are not negotiating, she said. We are just continuing. Yes, he said. Continuing. The spring came to Edinburgh with its usual grey reluctance and then sudden, committed warmth. And the Corvinus court settled into the particular rhythm of an institution, recovering from prolonged mismanagement with the specific combination of resentment and relief that institutions demonstrate when the correct authority is restored. The court members, who had been complicit in Voss's scheme, were processed through the tribunal in order of culpability. Those who had participated under coercion, and there were more of these than Dahlia had initially expected, which was a sobering reminder of the difference between corruption and fear, were dealt with through processes of accountability rather than purely punitive measures, which was a policy physician Leander held with a precision that made clear it was principle rather than sentimentality. You could make examples, one of the senior court members said, in a formal session that Dahlia attended in her official capacity as Arden firm liaison. The court would understand severity. The court would respond to severity, Leander said. That is not the same thing as understanding it. I have no interest in governing through spectacle. Some members question whether clemency is strength. Some members are welcome to question it, Leander said pleasantly. I find I am not particularly interested in administering a court that requires constant theatrical demonstration of my willingness to be brutal. If my authority rests on fear rather than legitimacy, it is not authority worth having. The room had been quiet after that, in the way that very pointed truths tend to make rooms quiet. Dahlia had caught his eye across the table and something had passed between them that was entirely wordless and entirely clear. Recognition. Admiration, the specific pleasure of watching someone be completely and uncompromisingly themselves. There were difficult conversations too, not between them, but about them, which had the particular quality of being both inevitable and exhausting. The question of the blood bond came up formally at a tribunal inquiry session in the 2nd month. Under vampire law, the bloodstone seal that Leander had given Dahlia was a recognized form of protection and formal acknowledgement, but it was not technically the deepest level of bond available that required a mutual blood bond, freely given, witnessed, and registered with the tribunal, and it carried rights and legal standing that far exceeded the seal. The tribunal elder who raised the question did so with the careful neutrality of someone presenting information rather than a position. The heir's human consort, the elder said, not unkindly, but with the directness of creatures for whom diplomatic softening is a learned rather than natural behavior, currently holds the seal, which provides the protections outlined in sections 7 through 12 of the Intercourt Human Relations Code. The full bond would extend protections under sections 1 through 6, including blood law immunity within all courts that recognize the Corvinus line, medical and longevity provisions, and standing before the tribunal itself as a recognized party. I am aware of what the full bond provides, Leander said. The question before this panel is whether the heir intends to formalize the bond within the standard registration period. The question before this panel, Leander said, with the very specific quality of someone who is being patient with a conversation they find somewhat impertinent, is the restructuring of the Corvinus Court alliance agreements. The nature of my personal bond with Miss Arden is not a tribunal matter unless both parties choose to make it one. Dahlia had spoken then, which had surprised the panel slightly, because she had been listed as observer witness for this session rather than primary party. I want it noted for the record, she said, that the question of any further formalization between the heir and myself is an ongoing personal discussion between two adults who are not being rushed by procedural timelines, and that the absence of formalization does not in any way indicate uncertainty or lack of commitment on either side. The elder had looked at her with the particular expression of very old vampires who find themselves unexpectedly impressed by something young. Noted, the elder had said. She and Leander had talked about it that night, in the quiet of the Edinburgh safe house that had become, over the months, something close to a shared space. His manuscripts and her files coexisting on the long table, her tea things beside his collection of objects that she had come to understand were the accumulated small weights of 4 centuries of a life. The bond, she said. I want to talk about it properly. Yes, he said. I know. Not because of the tribunal session, but because it is a real question and we should address it like the practical people we both are. We are, he agreed. What does the full bond mean for me? She asked. Medically, physically. I want to understand exactly what I am considering, he told her. Fully, precisely, without softening or overselling. The longevity provisions, the bond slowed certain aspects of human aging without eliminating them, a process that was complex and still not perfectly understood even after millennia of practice. The blood law immunity, real and legally absolute, the binding nature, mutual, deep, irreversible in the sense that the psychological and emotional connection it created was not something that simply dissolved if the relationship ended, though the legal bond could be dissolved by mutual agreement before the tribunal. The risk. There was always a risk with any blood bond process, small but real, and he described it clearly, without dramatizing it. And for you, she asked, what does it mean for you? He was quiet for a moment. It means that you are formally mine to protect, he said, which I recognize I already treat as true, so perhaps the practical difference on that front is limited. It means that you have standing and I have responsibility that is publicly and legally recorded. It means, he stopped. It means I cannot pretend, even to myself, that you might be a temporary reality, which is a pretense I have not been maintaining, but which I have been allowing to exist as a theoretical possibility, because the alternative required admitting something I was not certain I was permitted to need. What are you permitted to need? She asked quietly. He looked at her across the table, across the manuscripts and the files and the tea things, and the accumulated evidence of a shared life built from documents and midnight meetings, and the very specific project of making the world safer for both the things he was responsible for and the person he had come to love. You, he said, plainly, without elaboration. Like someone who has found the exact right word after a very long search and has no interest in adding to it. The bond was registered with the tribunal on a Wednesday morning in May, witnessed by Aldrich and 2 tribunal elders and the senior member of the Arden firm's board who had been managing the company since Dahlia had taken on the court work and who had, upon receiving an explanation of the situation, responded with the phlegmatic competence of someone who had spent 30 years in human-vampire liaison work, and was not particularly astonished by anything that fell within the range of complex but logical. The ceremony was brief and formal and very old, conducted in the Latin that vampire courts used for matters of legal record, and when it was done, Dahlia felt the change in the way one feels the moment after a door closes. Not dramatically, not with theatrical force, but with the specific settling quality of a thing becoming complete. Leander looked at her afterward with an expression she had learned to read correctly by then. The deep, quiet version of what very controlled people express when they are genuinely moved. He lifted her hand and pressed his lips to the bloodstone ring, which had been the first mark and which she had never taken off, and the formality of the gesture and the warmth underneath it were both completely true and entirely him. "Good morning, Lady Corvinus," he said. "That is going to take some adjustment," she said. "You have time," he said. "Technically infinite time, if the longevity provision goes as planned." Technically, he agreed, and she could hear, very clearly, that he was not saying it with the flatness of a man who found the prospect of infinite time with her to be merely technically accurate. He was saying it with the particular tone of someone who has been alone for a very long time and has very recently been presented with the opposite condition, and finds it to be, beyond all expectation, not merely adequate but extraordinary. The Arden firm and the Corvinus court alliance was formally re-executed in June, before a full assembly of all allied human and vampire institutions, and under the witnessing authority of the tribunal. It was a significant public moment. The restoration of a 30-year partnership that had been one of the foundational structures of human-vampire cooperation in Western Europe, and its restoration under the joint representation of Leander Corvinus and Dahlia Arden. I carried a political weight that was, several of the assembled elders noted with a specific approval of creatures who valued good precedent. Considerably greater than either party separately, Dahlia gave the address for the human side. She had been thinking about what to say for a week, and in the end she said the most truthful version of what she understood. This alliance was built by my father on the premise that human and vampire interests are not inherently opposed. That cooperation, rooted in genuine mutual respect and transparency, produces outcomes that neither world achieves alone. He was right. He spent 30 years proving it, and what the last year has demonstrated, through all of its difficulty, is not that the premise was naive, but that it requires constant active defense, not against the other side of the alliance, but against those within both worlds who benefit from division and opacity. She paused. My father's last instruction to me was to find the Corvinus heir first. I think what he meant was find the person who also believes that truth is worth the cost. I did. This is the result. There was a long, genuinely quiet moment in the hall after she finished. The kind of quiet that is not absence but presence. A room of people who have heard something true and are taking the time to let it be true. Leander spoke after her. He was brief, as he always was in formal settings. 400 years had given him the deep understanding that brevity in the right moment is a form of respect rather than curtness. He spoke about the alliance in terms of its history and its future, and about the principle that the Corvinus line had held since its founding, that the protection of legitimate human interests was not charity or concession, but the basic condition of a world worth inhabiting. And then he said, in a tone that was entirely personal despite the formal setting, Miss Arden, Lady Corvinus, made this restoration possible through intelligence, courage, and the specificity of vision that I hope this alliance, going forward, will be adequate to deserve. I intend to spend considerable time ensuring that it is. There was applause, genuine and extended from both human and vampire delegates, which was uncommon enough in joint proceedings to be noted. Aldrich found Dahlia during the reception afterward and pressed a glass of champagne into her hand with the expression of someone who has been waiting a very long time to have a genuinely good evening. Your father, he said, would have been insufferably pleased. He would have, Dahlia agreed. He would have been very quietly insufferable about it for weeks. He would have said something understated and deeply accurate. Something like, good. That was the point, she offered. Aldrich laughed, deep and old and warm. Exactly like that. Leander appeared at her side, which was less a movement and more a fact. He was elsewhere and then he was there, the way that very fast, Very practiced things happen with no visible intermediate stage. He looked at the champagne in her hand and the expression of someone who had just been laughing, and the look on his face was the one she had been cataloguing for months. The private one, the one that was not for the court or the tribunal or the assembled allies, but only for her. "Are you ready to leave?" he said. "Are the proceedings finished?" "The formal proceedings. The informal ones will continue for several hours. Our presence is not required for those." "Then yes," she said. "I'm ready." They left through the side entrance into an Edinburgh evening that had decided for once to be soft and clear. The old city stone gold in the last light, the sky above the castle a deep and particular blue. Leander walked beside her, unhurried, and this, the specific quality of unhurried, was something she had come to understand as a form of communication. He was never in a hurry when he was with her. He moved through time like someone who has finally found a use for it. "I keep thinking about what you said," she told him, "at the Highgate, about being invisible, about the long time before. What about it? I want to understand it better. Not to fix it. I know it is not a problem to fix. But to understand what it was like. If you want to tell me." He was quiet for a few steps. The evening deepened around them, the streetlights coming on in the warm, amber way of old cities that have not entirely surrendered their character to modernity. "There is a specific quality," he said finally, "to being in a room full of people who use your name and mean something by it. But the thing they mean is not you. They mean a bloodline, a seal, a legal instrument, a useful fiction. And you are present, physically present, and none of that presence lands anywhere real." He paused. "It accumulates over time, centuries of it. You begin to wonder if you have simply become the fiction. If the real person has been so comprehensively overwritten by the court symbol that there is nothing else left." "There was always something else left," Dahlia said. "I know that now. You knew it before, you were just not certain anyone else could see it." He stopped walking, she stopped with him, and they were on a quiet section of the Royal Mile, old stone on either side, the evening sky overhead, and he was looking at her with the complete, focused attention that was, she had come to understand, the most personal thing he knew how to offer. The full presence of 4 centuries of intelligence and care directed entirely at one person. "You are quite remarkable," he said, in the tone of someone making an observation they have verified from every available angle and are confident in the result. "I know," she said, which was not vanity but the same comfort with accurate self-assessment that she applied to everything, and which made him make the short, warm sound that was as close as he reliably came to laughing in genuine delight. He took her hand, and they walked on into the Edinburgh evening, past the old stones and the lit windows and the long, patient history of the city. And there was nothing unresolved between them, and nothing looming ahead that they were not equipped to face. And the particular quality of the air between them was the quality that very few things achieve and which, when they do, is unmistakable, complete. Present. True, in the months that followed, the Corvinus court re-established itself as the center of vampire-human cooperation it had been built to be, and the Arden firm recovered its full operational standing under Dahlia's leadership with the additional credibility of the Corvinus alliance, and the joint work of managing both, which was considerable, detailed, and frequently complicated, became the shared project of 2 people who were well matched in ways that had nothing to do with circumstance and everything to do with character. They disagreed sometimes. Productively, with the specific vigor of 2 intelligent people who both cared deeply about getting things right and were confident enough in each other to argue for their positions. Leander's 4 centuries of court governance and Dahlia's 30 years of observed institutional knowledge and her own forensic sharpness produced, in combination, an approach to court management that the tribunal elders, with the measured enthusiasm of people who had seen many courts and were not easily impressed, described as unusually sound. There was still danger, because there is always danger, and the world is not restructured overnight, and the people who had benefited from the old disorder did not simply stop existing because they had been removed from the court. 3 times in the first year, Leander placed himself between Dahlia and something moving with intent, with the absolute and unhasty precision of someone who has been protecting the people in his care for centuries, and finds that protecting this particular person is neither burden nor obligation, but the deepest possible expression of the fact that she matters to him. The third time, after the situation had been resolved and the individuals responsible identified and handed over to the joint panel, Dahlia turned to him and said, entirely sincerely, "I love you." It was the first time she had said it explicitly, because she was careful with her words and did not use the most important ones until she was certain they were accurate, which she had been for some time, and had been waiting for the right moment, and had determined that the right moment was simply the moment when it was most true, which was this one. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. "I know," Leander said. And his voice was the very specific quality of someone who is saying something they have known for a long time and have been waiting to hear confirmed, not because they doubted it, but because confirmation is its own beautiful thing, distinct from and additional to knowledge. "You are supposed to say it back," Dahlia said. "I know that too," he said, and there was nothing teasing in it, only honesty. And then, "I love you. I have loved you since Edinburgh. Since the 6th meeting when you pushed the evidence folder back across the table and said this is enough to take to the tribunal, and your voice was so completely certain, and I thought, there is a person who has decided what is true and what is worth doing, and nothing will move her from it, and I have been looking for exactly that quality in the world for a very long time." "You could have said so considerably earlier," she said. "I was not certain I was allowed." "You are always allowed," she said. "To say what is true, to want what you want, to be present, you are always allowed." He was quiet for a moment, and in the quiet she could feel the weight of what those words meant to something that had spent centuries being systematically denied exactly that permission. "I understand that now," he said. "You have been very consistent about making it clear." "I intend to remain so," she said. "I am counting on it," he said, and kissed her, in the hallway of the Edinburgh court building, in the warm gold light of the wall sconces, with the full and unhurried presence of someone who is exactly where they mean to be and intends to remain there. The year turned, and the work continued, and the world that Marcus Arden had spent 30 years building, and that Voss's faction had spent 7 years hollowing, was rebuilt on better ground, with better foundations, by people who understood that the most important thing about an alliance is not its legal architecture, but the willingness of the parties to see each other clearly and act accordingly. Dahlia kept the bloodstone ring. She would wear it for the rest of her life, through the decades of work and argument and laughter and danger and the long, deepening conversation of two people who had found in each other the specific thing that 4 centuries of courts and 30 years of institutional training had not provided elsewhere, which was the experience of being seen. Not as symbol, not as instrument, not as heir or heiress or bloodline or firm, but as the full and complicated and genuine person that each of them had always been, and that each of them had been waiting, in their different ways and across their extraordinary difference of years, to have reflected back. Leander was no longer invisible to his court. He had not been invisible since the night Dahlia had stood in the grand hall with a folder of evidence against her ribs and the bloodstone ring on her hand, and made the entire assembled court reconsider what they thought they knew about the heir they had been pretending was not there. But more than that, more than the court, more than the political reality, more than the legal architecture of re-established alliances and tribunal registrations and restored bloodline standing, he was visible to her, fully, completely, in every complicated and ancient and searching part of himself that he had spent 4 centuries pulling back from the world, because the world had not had anywhere to put it. She had made a place. He had walked into it with his whole self and stayed, and that, above every strategic success and legal victory and political restoration the year had produced, was the thing that Dahlia Arden thought of on the first morning of the 2nd year, lying in the grey Edinburgh dawn with Leander reading beside her, and the bloodstone warm on her hand, and the old city outside the window, beginning its daily negotiation with the light. Her father had said, "Find him first." She had. And then she had seen him. And then she had let herself be seen in return. And the world, complicated and ancient, and full of both danger and grace as it was, had made room for both of them in it, together, which was not a small thing. It was, in the end, exactly enough.